I always thought buying a car was the responsible choice. Leasing? That was for people who wanted a new car every few years and didn't care about building wealth. At least, that's what I believed. Then I built a spreadsheet. And halfway through, I realized I wasn't comparing two cars. I was comparing two completely different ways of using money.
I thought I'd start with the easiest comparison. Buying this SUV meant putting $10,000 down. Leasing it meant only $2,000 due at signing. $8,000. I wrote it down, circled it, and almost moved on. Buying costs more upfront, case closed. But then I asked something I probably should have asked before circling anything. Why $10,000? That wasn't a rule, it was just the dealer's default sheet. So I ran it again at $5,000 down instead. The payment went up, but barely. Smaller jump than I expected. Then I ran $20,000. Payment dropped further, obviously, but I wanted to know how much further, and the number surprised me. Each additional $1,000 bought less relief than the one before it. Diminishing returns? Nobody warns you about that part, which raised an obvious question. If putting more down always lowers the payment, even a little, why doesn't everyone just pay in cash and skip the whole exercise? That's exactly when my phone rang. Brandon. See? That's why I always buy. I even paid cash for my last truck. For a second, genuinely, I thought, there it is. No payment beats every version of this math I just run. Case actually closed this time, except I wanted to check whether Brandon had actually won or just felt like he had. I asked what that $40,000 had been doing before it became a truck. Turned out, not much. Some in a savings account earning next to nothing, some just sitting around. His words, not invested, not working. So I ran two more versions. First, what if Brandon had financed the truck at 2% instead and put the $40,000 into an index fund? At 2%, borrowing was basically free. The math tilted hard toward financing and investing the difference. Then I ran the same scenario at 8%, completely different outcome. At 8%, the interest cost ate most of what the invested $40,000 would have earned, and paying cash started looking smart again. Which meant Brandon hadn't necessarily won or lost. He'd made a decision that was right or wrong. Depending on an interest rate, he'd probably never actually compared it against. I turned the same test on myself. What if my own $10,000 sat in an index fund instead the entire time I was making a slightly higher monthly payment? I ran it at a plain, boring return. Nothing aggressive. Across the years, I figured I'd actually keep the car. The number that came back wasn't dramatic, but it wasn't nothing either. Enough that the down payment is just gone. Stopped being true the moment I actually tested it. I thought the down payment settled the argument. Instead, it created the first one. That money hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed jobs. I just didn't know what job it had. Whichever payment is smaller is the better deal. Or so I figured. Buying, $780 a month. Leasing, $520. A $260 gap every month for years. First, I wanted to know if $260 was even a fixed number, or just an artifact of the loan I'd been quoted. I stretched the loan term from 60 months to 72. Payment dropped, gap shrank. Stretched it further to 84, dropped again. Which meant the $260 difference I'd been treating like a fact of nature was actually a choice I'd made without noticing. A longer loan buys a smaller monthly gap at the cost of paying interest for years longer. That felt like cheating the comparison rather than solving it. So I went back to the standard 60-month term and left it there. With that settled, I ran the $260 through the calculator across 5 years, a few $1,000s. Nice, not life-changing. I felt smug about finding leasing's real advantage. Leasing wins, more breathing room, and now provably more money too. Then I ran it across 10 years instead of 5. The number made me sit up. I ran 20, mostly out of curiosity, not because it applied to this decision. And didn't believe it, so I ran it again slower, checking every field. Same number. Bigger than I expected a car payment gap could ever become. But that whole result depends on an assumption I hadn't tested, that the $260 gets invested at all. What if it just funds a slightly nicer version of my life every month instead? A vacation, a phone upgrade, and I never notice it leaving. I ran the same $260 four ways: vacation, gadget, extra mortgage principal, index fund. The mortgage version stopped me for a second. Paying down principal early is a guaranteed return. Exactly my mortgage rate, no risk. The index fund's average return was higher, but not guaranteed. So which one actually wins depends on something I can't calculate. How much a sure thing is worth to me versus a probably bigger thing that isn't sure. I didn't have an answer for that. I just knew it wasn't a rounding error either way. Spent it was the only version that actually lost. I thought of Alex, who automates every gap like this into an index fund before it has a chance to become anything else, and asked what was actually sitting in his account from doing exactly this for a few years. Not hypothetical, real, sitting there from a decision that felt this small every month. The $260 was never really extra room. It was a decision, disguised as relief, made automatically whether I noticed it or not. A lower payment isn't cheaper. It's just available, which drags me somewhere I didn't expect: depreciation. The thing everyone told me leasing people pay for. The thing I was sure I didn't. Depreciation is a lease problem, I figured. I own my car. I don't pay it. First, I wanted to check the claim I'd heard my whole life, that a new car loses value the second it leaves the lot. Actually true, it turns out, but not by nearly as much as the joke implies. The bigger drop happens over the first year, not the first mile. So the story was directionally right and specifically wrong, which is usually where the interesting part is. I pulled a luxury sedan, a Toyota, an EV, and a truck side by side. Wildly different curves. The luxury car lost value like it was on fire. Turns out luxury depreciation isn't really about the car. It's about resale demand collapsing once the new model year shine wears off. The Toyota barely moved because reliability reputation holds resale value almost by itself. The EV surprised me the most. Technology and battery range anxiety age an EV the way a new phone ages an old one, fast, in a way a gas engine just doesn't. That alone told me depreciation wasn't one number. It was a category with huge variance, and I'd been treating it like a fixed cost the entire time. Then I found something that briefly wrecked the whole theory. During COVID, used car prices went up. Depreciation reversed. For a second I thought, okay, so depreciation is unavoidable isn't even reliably true. So I pulled actual resale listings for cars matching mine at 3, 5, and 7 years old. Not theory. Real asking prices, real history. Under normal conditions, the exception disappeared. The curve goes one direction outside of a once-in-a-generation shortage. Down. Consistently. Predictably. That led to a question I hadn't planned on. If I financed longer to shrink the monthly payment, like I'd tested earlier, could I end up owing more than the car is worth? I ran it. Yes, easily, especially in the first 2 years of a 72-month loan. Being underwater isn't a leasing problem either. It's what happens when the loan outpaces the depreciation curve, which a longer term makes worse, not better. Which brought it back to my SUV. If it loses roughly $18,000 in value over 4 years, somebody pays for that. I do. I just don't get a line item. I find out later, all at once, the day I try to sell it. My friend Maya found this out the expensive way. Leased a car, came in 4,000 miles over at turn-in, handed a bill on the spot. She was furious. I got charged for driving my own car. Except she hadn't been charged for driving it. She'd been charged for the exact thing I was about to realize I was also paying for. just later, quieter, with nobody itemizing it for me. Nobody escapes depreciation. They just pay for it differently. We're both paying the same cost on different schedules, which means leasing has no cash locked in a down payment, a lower monthly, and, apparently, the same depreciation. By every measure I'd tested so far, leasing was winning on every front. At this point, I was convinced leasing was the smarter choice. Then one number completely ruined that conclusion. If leasing wins on cash, on monthly payment, and depreciation is a wash, leasing must simply be the better financial decision. Full stop, no asterisk. That's where I was standing. I got out a whiteboard, wrote down every car I've actually owned. 2005 Civic, 2010 Accord, 2014 Tacoma, 2018 SUV. How many years each? I did the math on the board, not in my head, because I didn't trust myself not to round in my own favor. 3 years, 4, at the outside. I have never once driven a car to the point where it owed me nothing. Here's the part that broke the leasing wins on everything theory. Leasing never stops. A new down payment, a new monthly payment, every few years, forever. But buying, held long enough, eventually clears the loan entirely and stops costing anything at all. That's a mechanism leasing structurally cannot offer, no matter how good its numbers look in years 1 through 4. It only shows up if you actually hold on. So I tried to find the exact point it shows up. Ran the math at year 5. Still leasing ahead, buying's advantage hadn't caught up yet. Year 7? Closer, but leasing still had it. It wasn't until well past that, once the loan itself was actually gone, and the car kept running for years afterward, that owning started pulling ahead for real. Which meant the eventually free advantage wasn't a light switch. It was a threshold. And most people, myself included, had no idea how far out that threshold actually sat. Which sent me back to the whiteboard with a harder question. How long do people actually hold on? I asked around. Parents, friends, Brandon, Derek. Everyone had a number in their head. Almost nobody's actual history matched the number they gave me. Derek was the clearest example. Ask him, and he'll tell you, flatly, I buy because I keep my cars forever. He's on his 4th truck in 6 years. He wasn't lying to me. He was lying to himself. The exact same way I just caught myself doing on the whiteboard 30 seconds earlier. Most people don't keep cars forever. They keep telling themselves they will, which means the eventually free advantage I just found for buying doesn't apply to almost anyone who claims it, including me, as of about 5 minutes ago. If I'm honest about how long I actually keep a car, not how long I imagine, what did all that money do in the meantime? Not at the end. Right now, tied up in something losing value every day, while I told myself a story about the future that wasn't going to happen. I already suspected this chapter was going to be the one that finally, cleanly settles it. I took the $8,000 down payment and the $260 monthly gap and ran them through a compound interest calculator using a plain, defensible average return. The years I said I'd keep the car. The number was uncomfortable but manageable. Fine. Buying loses, but not catastrophically. Okay, I have it. Buying loses. Opportunity cost settles the whole thing. Then, wait. What if someone never actually invests the difference? What if it just sits in checking or funds a nicer lifestyle instead? In that version, and only that version, the entire opportunity cost argument evaporates. Buying and leasing become roughly the same mistake, just shaped differently, which meant the real variable was never lease versus buy at all. It was whether the person makes any deliberate decision about that gap in either direction. Assuming they do, I widened the destinations one at a time to see if the answer held up everywhere or just in an index fund. Real estate, still ahead though slower and lumpier. paying down higher interest debt faster, ahead and with none of the market's uncertainty. A small business fund. Hardest to compare since the return isn't guaranteed at all, but the ceiling was the highest of anything I tested. Just sitting safely in treasuries, doing nothing risky whatsoever, still beat the car, by a smaller margin than I expected, but a real one. Every version beat parked in a depreciating asset, every single one. Assuming I'm the kind of person who does something with the gap, which is uncomfortably the entire premise of a channel about not letting money just happen to you. I ran the full number out over my real, honest holding period, not my imaginary one. The number that came back seemed wrong. I ran it again, slower, checking every field. Same number. Your car doesn't just cost what you paid for it, it costs what your money never became. I sat with that longer than I expected to, because if it's true, buying isn't just a different schedule for the same depreciation, like I decided 2 chapters ago. It might genuinely be the more expensive choice, period. Except that can't be universally true. People do come out ahead buying. I've heard that my whole life, and it can't just be wrong. So when does it stop being true? There has to be a point where buying actually wins outright. I just hadn't found it yet. I didn't go looking for variables. I went looking for the exact point where my last conclusion stopped making sense. 3 or 4 years of ownership. Opportunity cost wins, easily, no contest. 6 years? Closer. But still not close enough to matter. What if you actually kept it? 15 years. No more monthly payment for the back 2/3 of that stretch. The moment I ran that version, the whole shape of the answer flipped. There's a line somewhere between trade every 3 years and drive it into the ground, where ownership crosses over and starts winning. I only pulled an interest rate because the line moved when I changed it. A 2% loan and an 8% loan are not the same investigation. At 2%, the crossover point came years earlier. At 8%, it took nearly twice as long to arrive. And for a few of my test cases, it never arrived within any realistic holding period at all. I only looked at different depreciation curves because a truck and an EV don't lose value the same way, and pretending they do would have made the line fake. The Toyota's flat curve meant buying crossed over sooner. The EV's steep one meant it barely crossed over at all, even at 15 years. I only found the business owner exception because I couldn't finish the spreadsheet without asking what write-offs did to it. I wasn't hunting for a tax angle. The math forced the question on me. A business owner deducting the lease payment moved the whole comparison in leasing's favor in a way none of my other tests did, which meant the right answer for a W-2 employee and the right answer for a business owner weren't just different numbers. They were sometimes opposite conclusions, using the exact same car. I ran the same person through half a dozen versions of themselves. 3 years versus 15, cash versus 8% financing, a Toyota versus an EV, a W-2 employee versus a business owner. The line moved every time. Sometimes buying won by a landslide. Sometimes leasing wasn't even close. Buying isn't always smarter. It depends on where the line moves. Which meant I finally had a real answer, not a gut feeling, an actual one. Keep it long enough, buying wins. Otherwise, it doesn't. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Because none of this explains why Brandon paid cash for a truck he'll trade in 2 years, or why Derek insists he keeps cars forever while standing next to his 4th one. Or honestly, why I wanted the SUV with the $10,000 down payment in the first place instead of the cheaper one that made more financial sense from the start. People don't actually buy cars, they buy identity, certainty, status. The feeling of having decided something and being done deciding it. I built a spreadsheet to answer a math question. It answered a different one instead. After all of that, the down payment, the depreciation, Maya's overage fee, Derek's 4th truck, the calculator I ran twice, I realized lease versus buy was never the first question. The first question was how much car I decided I wanted before I ever walked into the dealership. Everything after that was just arithmetic. The dealership didn't decide whether you became wealthier. That decision happened the moment you chose how much of your money would spend the next 5 years sitting in your driveway instead of working somewhere else.